He died believing he had won, a smug smile frozen in his memory as the final act of a personal tragedy. The supposed weakness he so arrogantly thought he had discovered and exploited was, in reality, the epicenter of a meticulously designed trap, a mechanism of psychological annihilation from which there would be no escape. This is the story of how Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the master strategist of Harlem, transformed an enemy's distorted perception of love into his own sentence of oblivion. What happened in those days was not a simple retaliation, but a masterclass on the nature of power, demonstrating that touching a man's sanctuary does not reveal his vulnerability, but rather unleashes a force of retribution far more terrifying than any physical violence. Let us dissect the fatal mistake of a man who looked into the heart of a lion and saw a lamb, a miscalculation that wiped him off the map of New York's underworld forever, leaving behind only a whispered cautionary tale in the shadows. The scene takes place in late spring 1952, a time when Harlem breathed an air of renewed optimism, a feeling that the promises of the post-war era might finally begin to materialize. The neighborhood was alive, pulsating with the energy of jazz escaping through the doors of the clubs, and with the vitality of a community that refused to be defined solely by its struggles. Amidst this effervescence, during an outdoor music festival in Mount Morris Park, Bumpy Johnson allowed himself a rare moment of normalcy. He was there not as the king of the underworld, but as a husband beside his wife, Mamie, and a father watching with quiet, protective pride his daughter, Elise. To most, the scene was an idyllic portrait of family life. However, to a man observing from a distance a rising gangster named Slick Sammy, this image inspired not respect, but a cynical opportunity. In his ambitious and fundamentally limited mind, he didn't see the strength of a family bond, but rather a point of pressure, an exposed Achilles heel. Sammy's catastrophic mistake was born at that very moment, the presumption that Bumpy's humanity was synonymous with weakness, without realizing that that love was not a breach in his armor, but the very forge where his most relentless determination was tempered. To understand the depth of Sammy's mistake, one must comprehend what family meant in 1950s Harlem. The community was a complex mosaic of hope and adversity. On one hand, there was the growth of a black middle class, flourishing businesses, churches that were centers of social power, and an artistic and intellectual scene that continued to be a global cultural force. On the other, the overwhelming reality of racial discrimination, systemic poverty, precarious housing, and an often hostile police force was a daily constant. In this context, the family was not merely a social unit. It was the primary mechanism for survival, a fortified sanctuary against an outside world that was, at best, indifferent and, at worst, predatory. It was within the bonds of kinship that identity was preserved, values were transmitted, and resilience was nurtured. The family was the informal economy, the social welfare system, and the first line of defense. Attacking a man's family was not just a personal act. It was a violation of a sacred community code, an act of desecration against the only institution that offered refuge and meaning in a ruthless environment. Bumpy Johnson, more than any other figure of his time, personified this duality. He was a product of the harsh realities of Harlem, but also an architect of his own destiny, using the brutality of the system to his advantage. The empire he built, based on gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics, was, in his own mind, a means to an end. That end was the creation of an impenetrable fortress around his wife and daughter. All the money, all the power, all the calculated violence served a singular purpose: to isolate Mamie and Elise from the savagery of the world he inhabited and dominated. He was a man who lived in a state of permanent alert, aware that his enemies, in their frustration and lack of imagination, would inevitably try to use his family as a weapon against him. For Bumpy, it wasn't a question of if, but of when. Therefore, he would not only react to this threat, he anticipated it, planning his response with the same cold precision with which he planned a territorial acquisition, transforming what should have been his greatest vulnerability into an early warning system and a trigger for total and absolute retaliation. Bumpy Johnson's mind was his most formidable asset, a sophisticated labyrinth where Stoic philosophy met military strategy and street psychology. His rivals and even his allies often made the mistake of seeing him merely as another powerful gangster, defined by the strength of his men and his propensity for violence. They didn't see the man who spent hours in silence in his library, absorbing the lessons of history's great thinkers from Thucydides to Machiavelli. He didn't read for pastime. He read for application, extracting principles of power, deception, and control that he masterfully adapted to the wars fought on the avenues of Harlem. The game of chess was his favorite operational metaphor. He understood the importance of controlling the center of the board, the value of positional sacrifice, and above all, the art of thinking several moves ahead while his opponent was still focused on the immediate move. This ability to abstract, to see the big picture while everyone else only saw the fight around the corner, gave him an almost supernatural advantage. He wasn't just playing the game, he was defining its rules. Central to his reign was the projection of an aura of controlled and inescapable power. His calmness was legendary and profoundly unsettling. In a world of impulsive men whose emotions were displayed like badges of honor, Bumpy's impassivity was a terrifying anomaly. He spoke little, and when he did, it was with an economy of words that gave each syllable immense weight. He listened with an intensity that made others feel transparent, his eyes absorbing every detail, every micro-expression, every hesitation that betrayed a man's inner thoughts. This ability to read people's fundamental motivations, their greed, their fear, their pride, their insecurities, allowed him to manipulate situations without ever raising his voice. He knew that true intimidation comes not from a shout, but from a whisper that reveals you know your interlocutor's darkest secret. Bumpy didn't need explicit violence to rule. He ruled through perception, shaping the reality of his enemies and allies simply by controlling information and the psychology of the moment. His reputation, built on this foundation, often did the heavy lifting for him. Bumpy's code was a set of internal rules as rigid as any legal system, and its fundamental principle was the sanctity of family. This wasn't an abstract moral stance, it was the cornerstone of his operational universe. In his world, disputes over territory, money, or respect were part of the business, subject to negotiation, intimidation, or, if necessary, violence. There were rules of engagement, lines that could be crossed. However, the line involving family was absolute and non-negotiable. Crossing it was declaring that all rules were suspended. It was a signal that the opponent was no longer engaged in a conflict of interests, but in a war of annihilation. Bumpy extended this protection not only to his own family, but also to the families of his loyal men, understanding that this guarantee was the basis of their loyalty. By threatening Bumpy's daughter, Slick Sammy wasn't just breaking an unwritten rule of the underworld, he was committing an act of heresy against the central dogma of Bumpy Johnson's religion of power, a sin for which there was no forgiveness, only atonement. Slick Sammy, in contrast, was a one-dimensional product of crime. His worldview was devoid of nuance, reduced to a simple equation of force and intimidation. He saw power as an object to be taken, not as an ecosystem to be cultivated. His arrogance was fueled by a dangerous lack of imagination. He couldn't conceive of a mind more complex than his own. Observing Bumpy in the park, he applied the predator's crudest and most primitive logic. Find what the prey loves most, and use it as leverage. He didn't see the scene as a manifestation of the force that drove Bumpy, but as an exposed weakness, an invitation to attack. His threat was a reflection of his own intellectual limitations. Instead of a direct confrontation, he opted for a gesture he considered subtle and sophisticated, sending a single white gardenia, Mamie's favorite flower, to the Johnson residence. There was no note, no explicit demands. It was an act of psychological terrorism that in Sammy's mind was genius. He believed that the flower, a symbol of beauty and love, corrupted into a message of threat, would drive Bumpy to panic, forcing him to negotiate from a disadvantageous position. Bumpy's reaction to the gardenia was the antithesis of what Sammy expected. There was no panic, there were no desperate calls, there was only a cold, profound silence. The flower was not received as a threat, but as a confession. For Bumpy, that gesture was Sammy's admission that he lacked the intelligence or courage for a direct confrontation, resorting instead to the lowest and most predictable tactic. At that moment, Sammy ceased to be a rival and became a problem to be eliminated. Bumpy's trap began to close, not with the mobilization of armed men, but with an act of environmental manipulation. He instructed one of his associates to arrange a meeting with Sammy, choosing a location that was, in itself, a statement of power and a psychological weapon, the imposing main reading room of the New York Public Library. The choice was deliberate and brilliant. It was a sanctuary of silence, order, and knowledge, the exact opposite of the chaos and brutality of their world. It was Bumpy's territory, an intellectual battlefield where Sammy's weapons, physical intimidation, a bully-like attitude, would be completely useless. Slick Sammy arrived at the library feeling triumphant. The invitation to a meeting in such a public and unguarded location confirmed in his mind his theory. Bumpy was afraid, seeking a peaceful solution, exactly as he had predicted. He walked through the vast marble rooms with the arrogance of a conqueror, finding Bumpy at a secluded table, calmly engrossed in reading a leather-bound volume. The entire scene was designed to disarm him and inflate his ego. There were no visible bodyguards, no sign of danger. Sammy sat down, a smug smile on his face, and began his monologue. He spoke of the need to restructure business interests in Harlem, of new leadership, and of the importance of avoiding unnecessary conflict. Every word was a veiled euphemism for his extortion. The tension in the room was palpable, but purely psychological. A silent duel fought beneath the vaulted ceilings and among the shelves of accumulated knowledge. Sammy, believing he was in complete control, decided to deliver the coup de grace, the move that would seal his perceived victory. The situation became permanently irreversible when Sammy leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that barely disturbed the sacred silence of the library. "Your daughter," he said, the poison sweetened with a tone of feigned concern, "is a lovely girl. It would be a tragedy if the world suddenly became too dangerous a place for her to play in the street." In that instant, Sammy crossed a boundary from which there would be no return. He didn't just make a threat. He personalized it, verbalized the unthinkable, and in doing so triggered the final mechanism of Bumpy's trap. The air around the table seemed to freeze. The turning point wasn't marked by an explosion, but by stillness. Bumpy didn't react with anger or fear. He slowly, deliberately closed the heavy book he was reading. The sound of the leather clattering echoed in the vast hall like a single decisive toll of a bell, signaling the end of an era and the beginning of an execution. The time for conversation was over. Bumpy lifted his eyes from the book and fixed them on Sammy. The warmth and politeness had completely vanished, replaced by an abyssal, icy emptiness that seemed to suck all the light and air away. It was a look of pure annihilation. "There are certain things in a man's life that are sacred, Sammy," Bumpy said, his voice a low, controlled whisper, but with a hardness that cut like a shard of glass. "They are the things he protects, not because they are weak, but because they make him strong. You are foolish enough not to understand the difference." It was then that Bumpy revealed his counter-offensive, not with a threat but with a presentation of facts. With calm, terrifying precision, he began to describe the daily routine of Sammy's elderly and ailing mother, who lived in a modest, isolated house in the Queens neighborhood. He detailed the name of the baker she visited, the color of the shawl she liked to wear on the porch in the afternoon, and even the name of the neighbor's dog that barked when the mailman arrived. He painted such an intimate and detailed picture that blood began to drain from Sammy's face. The final blow was delivered with the same surgical precision. "By the way," Bumpy added almost as an afterthought, "a very helpful young man moved into the house next door last week. He's been helping her with the shopping and fixed her fence. She adores him." He paused, letting the weight of that information sink in. "He's one of my best men." At that moment, Slick Sammy's universe crumbled. Arrogance was instantly replaced by a primal, visceral terror. He realized with a suffocating clarity the abysmal depth of his miscalculation. Bumpy hadn't just neutralized his threat, he had mirrored and amplified it 1,000-fold, using Sammy's own weapon, familial love against him. Bumpy didn't need to threaten Sammy's mother. He simply demonstrated an omnipresent ability to reach her, transforming a perceived act of kindness into an act of sinister surveillance. Sammy was no longer in a negotiation. He was a hostage in a war he didn't even know was being fought. The consequence was the complete and utter psychological collapse of Slick Sammy. He left the New York Public Library not as the conquering gangster he had entered, but as a broken man his psyche shattered. The smug smile had been replaced by a mask of pure terror. He understood that Bumpy didn't operate on the same plane as him. He was playing a different game, with rules Sammy couldn't even comprehend. The genius of Bumpy's retaliation was the absence of physical violence. He left no mark on Sammy's body, but inflicted a mortal wound on his soul, stripping him of his confidence, his position, and his very sense of security. In the following days, without another word being exchanged, Sammy frantically liquidated all his businesses and interests in Harlem for a fraction of their real value. He sold his cars, his apartment, and then, like a ghost, vanished from New York City, extinguished not by a bullet, but by a display of intellectual power. The symbolic message of this silent confrontation resonated throughout the underworld with the force of an explosion. Slick Sammy's story became an instant cautionary tale, a piece of criminal folklore that would be told and retold for years. The lesson was unequivocal. Bumpy Johnson's family was not his weakness. It was a red line connected to a comprehensive and inescapable system of retaliation. Attempting to use his loved ones against him was not an act of war. It was an act of strategic suicide. Sammy's disappearance was more effective than any body left in an alley, for it proved that Bumpy possessed a far more terrifying form of power, the ability to destroy a man from the inside out, to dismantle his reality and force him into exile. He didn't just kill the body, he killed the spirit, which was in many ways a far worse fate. The historical impact of this event was profound and lasting. It cemented the most important unwritten rule in New York's organized crime. Families, especially those of men of Bumpy Johnson's caliber, were sacrosanct. This principle, established so dramatically, helped create an appearance of civility and predictability in an inherently chaotic world. For Bumpy, it elevated his status from a territorial gang boss to that of a patriarch, a figure whose dominion extended beyond the physical and into the realm of untouchable moral principles. He proved to be not only the strongest man in Harlem, but also the most intelligent, a true grandmaster in the high-voltage chess game of power. History serves as definitive proof of his central philosophy. True strength lies not in the absence of vulnerabilities, but in the wisdom and courage to transform what enemies perceive as a weakness into their most formidable and decisive weapon.